Hey fam, I want you to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications. I want to now tell you about this story out of Harvard, where Harvard has been profiting. New York Times reported this. Harvard has been profiting from these photo images of slaves. It really was a remarkable story that was done by Harvard. And so you see one of the, the story was done by the New York Times. You see right there some of the photos that Harvard has been profiting from. This is really caused an uproar. In fact, I was sitting here just a few moments ago. I had retweeted something from Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who raised the question, why should they be profiting from these various photos? Should that be income that actually goes to the ancestors of those particular slaves? And so right now we want to go to Attorney Ben Crump. He's actually representing the granddaughter of one of those slaves. And so, Ben Crump, glad to have you here. Tamara Lanier, glad to have you here as well. Ben, a few moments ago, you sent me the complaint you guys filed. And so walk us through exactly what is it that you are demanding from Harvard?
Yes, sir, Roland. First of all, thank you so much for covering this matter. Miss Tamara Lanier, the great-great-great-granddaughter of Renty, who was enslaved in South Carolina, Harvard preeminent Professor Louis Agassiz, a very celebrated scientist who we know today was a racist who sought to legitimize that blacks were inferior to white people. While Abraham Lincoln was talking about Emancipation Proclamation, Harvard was going out and saying, no, blacks are inferior and should be on the plantation. Well, this lawsuit today says that Renty is 169 years a slave. And we has two questions in this lawsuit, Roland. Number one, how long will Harvard continue to condone slavery? And number two, when will Harvard finally free Renty?
Ms. Lenier, this is it's an interesting story. First of all, go to my iPad, please. I have up the actual story from the New York Times. In Who Should Own Photos of Slaves, the Descendants, not Harvard, a lawsuit says. We also know, of course, when we found out that Georgetown essentially was saved as a result of the selling of slaves as well. Now we hear this about what Harvard is able to do. When did you first learn about these photos?
I first learned about the photos in 2011 after the passing of my mother. And I came to learn about the photos because of a promise that I made to my mother. Throughout my childhood and throughout the childhood of my children, my mother would always tell us the story. She referred to him fondly as Papa Renty. And my mother talked about Papa Renty. She shared with us the stories that were shared with her. My mother heard these stories from her grandfather, who was Renty's grandson. So I'm not that many generations removed from slavery, but my mother spoke of Renty as a family icon. She was proud of her enslaved ancestors. She talked about them often. She talked about them with my sister and I. She talked about them with my children. And when she became ill and was close to dying, it became important to her that I write this story down, that I document this story. At that time, I wasn't aware of the daguerreotypes. I wasn't aware of the images. I was just trying to live out a promise that I had made to my mother. So after my mom's passing, I felt compelled to put together the story about Renty and our family genealogy as I had promised. And at that time, in 2010 and 2011, we didn't have access to Ancestry.com like we have today. The information wasn't as readily available as it is today, and I really wasn't prepared to do that kind of research. And I actually shared my story with a local restaurant owner who said that he enjoyed doing the research and he was willing to help. I told him the stories that my mom told me. I gave him the names that my mom shared with me. And I didn't go back to that restaurant for several weeks. But when I did, when I walked in, he was very excited. And he said, I found an image of your grandfather on the internet. And that's when I first became aware of the image.
Ben,
and Roland,
go ahead.
This is before the image. She had the oral history. So when Harvard starts saying, well, she can't prove her linear descendancy, well, these are the oral histories that was told to her before this famous iconic image that had been used in movies like Roots and 12 Years a Slave. They believe these daguerreotypes, the earliest known forms of photographs of African slaves, are worth conservatively between $20 and $30 million. Now, Harvard has these, and they have been complicit when she asked for them to engage her about she being the lineal descendants. They wouldn't even do it. They dismissed it and said, no, these are for educational purposes.
Well, we're certainly going to keep following this story here. We certainly thank both of you for coming on the show to explain this lawsuit. Harvard has not commented. We certainly wait to hear what they have to say. Ben Crump, Ms. Lanier, thanks so much. I appreciate it. All right, again, I want to thank both of you for being with us. Quickly, I want to go to my panel here to talk about this here because, again, what this also speaks to, folks, is still, as Ben Crump actually said in the New York Times story, where folks are still profiting off of slaves. Chris Metzler, conservative strategist, author of Divided We Stand, The Search for America's Soul. Also joining us is Erica Savage Wilson, host Savage Politics Podcast. And that's really what we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. What people need to understand is if you think about Jews, the reality is after World War II, to this day, the search continues for artifacts that were owned by Jews, that were actually stolen, that were taken by Germany and other countries as well, and was returned back to those families. In the case of slaves, they were property, right, but their image and likeness is still theirs. Chris, you have a legal background. Your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, this to me is an absolutely unbelievable story. The fact that they think they can just appropriate someone's image and use the term educational purposes. Well, even with educational purposes, we have copyright and copyright infringement, and you still have to pay folks for their image. It is a pure economic issue in which what should happen is Harvard, if they had any sense, would just settle this and move on, because from a damages standpoint, from an economic damage standpoint, they are in big trouble here. They cannot advance the argument, well, they were property. That argument is not going to work, particularly since they are continuing to profit. So even if you believe they were property before, well, once they were no longer property, then what happened?
And Erica, the other issue is this here, and so I would not advise Harvard to use the argument, well, how can you actually know in terms of tracing your history back? Because black folks, of course, were raped and beaten and families broken up, so we couldn't trace our history because we were property. To me, if you're Harvard, you say, I'm not going to make that argument, so if we can't establish ownership, hey, we will donate any proceeds or whatever to the Smithsonian Museum of National African American History or to an HBCU or whatever, but that's, to me, that's not the one you want to make.
Oh, absolutely. But it really goes back to the 3/5 compromise, that black folks are still fighting for their humanity, for us to be seen as humans. And that number, $20 to $30 million, these are the type of things that we're talking about when the discussions now are raised more, but they've not just began around reparations, about black people getting their due because our humanity was stripped in such a way that we have not been able to catch up economically, housing-wise, education-wise. So for Harvard, I think it would have been best for them to first maybe pick up the phone and talk with someone from Georgetown first before they released a statement about not being able to to track who and what this photograph that particularly belongs to, especially since we have a culture of
Chris, real quick.
Yeah, so but the interesting thing is you are one of the world's premier legal and research institutions. You have all kind of folks with genealogy and all of that kind of stuff. You mean you just couldn't go down the hall and say to the head professor of genealogy, help us out here, before you made such an asinine statement?
Yeah.
All right, folks, back to our Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment. Calling all HBCU alumni, students, and leaders, enter the Ford Motor Company HBCU Mobility Challenge and win $25,000 for your school. Building on their long-term support of HBCUs, Ford is looking to improve mobility in HBCU communities through innovative solutions. The winning program will receive a grant up to $25,000 to implement their proposal. The deadline is near March 31st, 2019. Go to FGB.Life, FGB.Life for more information and to apply. Ford goes further in our community, and we certainly thank them for being a partner here at Roland Martin Unfiltered. Now back to your Roland Martin Unfiltered video.